because that's when I realized that if we could educate young people about issues of our time and engage them, many of them will become change makers and try to make a difference. It's basically education that teaches about what is happening in our world and invites people to work toward building a more just and humane and sustainable future. In the ideal situation, students would be able to identify a problem of concern to them so that it really stems from their own passions and concerns. We need students to understand what it looks like to research the causes of problems and to address them systemically, and that's solutionary work.
Good morning, Zoe. Thank you so much for joining us here at Education Action Forum of Maine for this interview today.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us just your title and the organization. You have the title right there behind you, but maybe just give us a little introduction.
Sure. So I co-founded this organization. So I'm the co-founder and the president of the Institute for Humane Education. And we are 26 years old this month.
Wow. Congratulations.
Wow.
So, of course, Institute for Humane Education, this is all about education. Where did you come in? When did you come into this work? Has this been a part of your life's path since the beginning, or is this something that kind of developed over the course of your career?
Well, I couldn't have thought of doing this work when I was young because it didn't really exist. So, I was one of those kids who every year I had a different, goal for what I wanted to be when I grew up. I went to college pre-med. I abandoned that path. I went to law school. I dropped out by Thanksgiving of my first semester. And I really wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life. I liked learning and I liked education. And I was actually studying world religions in divinity school because I was really fascinated by how people make meaning and people's belief systems and how that overlaps with how we care for other species in the environment. So I was in divinity school and I was looking for a summer job. And my then boyfriend, now husband, was in Philadelphia. And so I applied for positions, well, not really positions, but I applied to teach week-long courses for middle school students at the University of Pennsylvania in what was called then the Discovery Program. And maybe because I'd sort of been a dilettante and had done lots of different things, I pitched 5 courses to the director because, I knew a little bit about a lot of things, enough to teach a week-long course on a variety of topics. So one of the courses was on animal issues, and one of the courses was on environmental issues, and one of the courses was on critical television watching. And so the director said yes to all 5 of them. And apparently she must have been saying yes to lots of people because there were 60 courses offered that summer and not nearly enough students to fill them all. So my critical television watching course didn't have enough students. I don't know why students didn't want to come and learn how to critical. But what was interesting was that the animal issues course was the second most popular of those 60 courses. Now, obviously, this had nothing to do with me. This is my first year teaching there, so nobody knew me. But the topic was of interest to kids. And it was second only to robotics. And this was in 1987. So even back then, robotics was really popular. And I was a big Star Trek fan, so I thought that makes sense. Animal issues can come second to robotics. And so that course, I taught about what was happening to animals, and we engaged in what we could do about protecting animals. And the course had this huge impact on the students. And one boy, he became a change maker overnight. So in the middle of the week, I talked about product testing on animals, where everything from oven cleaner to mascara to shampoo are squeezed into the eyes of conscious rabbits, force fed to them in quantities that kill, and smeared on their abraded skin. And he went home that night and he made his own homemade leaflets. Now, this was in 1987. He did not have a personal computer. He hand wrote his leaflets. And he came back to class the next day and he wanted to hand them out. And he didn't want to hand them out to his classmates. They'd all learned about this. Right. He wanted to hand them out on the street. So while the rest of us were having lunch, he was standing on a Philadelphia street corner handing out his leaflets. Wow. So that, that course changed his life. He ended up doing all sorts of change-making efforts. And it also changed my life, because that's when I realized that education was so powerful, and that if we could educate young people about issues of our time and engage them, many of them will become change makers and try to make a difference. Well, two of the young people in that course, that first course I taught, went on to form a Philadelphia area-wide student group. One went on to win awards for his work. He's still doing change making to this day. For the last few decades, he's been working for the mayor of New York City in HIV/AIDS work. And so, I hadn't seen him for a couple of decades, and I invited him when I was speaking in New York City with Jane Goodall to come. And he came, and afterwards I was introducing him to some friends. And I said, "This is David." He was in the first humane education course I ever taught. And before I could even finish my sentence, he interjected, "That course changed my life." And of course, it changed my life, because that's when I realized that there was this field that I could develop called humane education. Although at the time, humane education was, for those people who'd even heard of it, was mostly oriented toward animal issues. And for me, humane education is so much broader than that. It's education about the interrelated issues of animals, certainly, but environmental issues, human rights and social justice issues. It's basically education that teaches about what is happening in our world and invites people to work toward building a more just and humane and sustainable future. And so that was my introduction to this work, and I never looked back. I ended up creating a humane education program in Philadelphia, where we were going into schools and doing single presentations and assembly programs and after school courses, and reaching about 10,000 kids a year, which sounds like a lot. But if you want to change the educational system, which I did, that was just a drop in the bucket. So in 1996, I co-founded the Institute for Humane Education, not only to promote this field, but to actually provide professional development for teachers and to create the first graduate programs in humane education, so that people could really learn about this field and integrate it. And, the big goal is to actually transform education itself, to elevate the purpose of schooling, and to have humane education disappear as a term, because it will be education, full stop.
Wonderful. Okay. So maybe now we can shift to then the history of IHE.
Sure. So in 1996, we formed the organization, and then we created a certificate program in humane education, and then ended up affiliating first with Cambridge College, then with Valparaiso University, and now with Antioch University, so that it would be a graduate program. And now we have an MA degree, an MEd degree, a graduate certificate, as well as the only doctoral program in education specializing in humane education in the world, as far as we know. So we have that. And, that's a very high level of education, as obviously. So that's not going to reach the vast majority of people. So we also started producing free resources, and we would do workshops. And, as the internet developed, so did our work. So it went from being only in-person workshops and summer institutes to being online courses. And we have a solutionary micro-credential program for educators, about 30 hours. And then we have loads of free downloadable resources on our website and videos. And I wrote a book. I've written several books, but the one on education, The World Becomes What We Teach, recently became an Amazon #1 bestseller in the philosophy and social aspects of education. So thank you.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. So, we have, I like to call it soup to nuts, because we have everything. If somebody just wants a single downloadable lesson plan, we've got that. It's all on our website, humaneeducation.org, all the way up to a doctoral program. So we try to meet teachers where they are and provide all the support that teachers and schools and administrators need.
Yeah. So I'm curious, thinking back to how you got started with your own group of students. And did you say they were high school students at the program?
Middle school
They were
students.
middle school. So that's what I thought you said. But then I thought, surely they must have been high school students. But okay, middle school students. Given that's where you stepped in, is there a reason that you focus on teacher education and not on starting schools?
Well, interesting you should ask that, because we actually went through about 18 months where we were going to start a school in New York City. And it for many reasons, we chose not to. And, when you think about how do you scale up and how do you make something take root everywhere, creating a model school is one way if other schools can adopt that and you have a demo school that can be replicated. And actually now there's a solutionary school in India that's based on our philosophy and work. So that is happening. But it's a very slow way. Even if you think about some school movements like Montessori or Waldorf, they've remained relatively small despite, having, the Waldorf movement is 100 years old. So in thinking about how to scale up, how to really transform education, we are now working with schools, with districts. We're seeing some places where this is taking root ever more deeply. And I'll talk about Maine in a minute, but in San Mateo County, California, which is a county that serves 113,000 students in 23 school districts. They have embraced our solutionary approach. So I haven't really gotten into that, but the very purpose of humane education in our minds is to educate what we call a generation of solutionaries who have the skills, the motivation, and who are able to address and solve real world problems within the curricula. So they took that approach and made it the philosophy and foundation for their entire county, serving all of those students. And they began training teachers with professional development opportunities. So hundreds of teachers have created solutionary units for their classrooms. And this is K-12. This is not like just middle school or just high school or just the early years. So it's pretty exciting.
That's amazing. And so when you said there are teachers creating solutionary units, can you give us a little picture? What is this? What you mentioned a little bit what a solutionary is, but maybe you could expand on what a solutionary is and then what a solutionary unit is.
Yes. Well, a solutionary unit is really going to differ from classroom to classroom, teacher to teacher. So, a math teacher's solutionary unit is going to be entirely different from social studies or language arts teacher or art teacher. This past week, we had our graduate students come for the first time in 3 years because of COVID. We didn't have our annual Humane Education Immersion Week for our graduate students. And we had one teacher there from Maine. She teaches at Greeley Middle School, and she's a music teacher. And she created a whole solutionary program within her choral curriculum. And they had a beautiful concert integrating solutionary learning and thinking and action into a concert. And she's created this whole program, which is she is now sharing with other teachers, other fine arts teachers, music teachers. And so this can get integrated into the arts. So that's just one teacher. And so this is happening all over, where teachers will create maybe a semester-long course. So we had one teacher in Portland, Maine, who created a high school elective, and it was a solutionary elective focused on human rights issues. And we've had other teachers integrate this into the whole year. And then other teachers say, no, this is going to fit as a 3-week unit that we're going to offer within our science program. Or one teacher in Blue Hill, she teamed up with a language arts teacher, and they had a science and language arts program with this solutionary approach. So when I say solutionary approach, what this means, and it varies from teacher to teacher and school to school, in the ideal situation, students would be able to identify a problem of concern to them, so that it really stems from their own passions and concerns. And then whatever course they're taking, they would be able to take the learning from that, whether it's language arts and communication, or it's social studies and history, or it's science or math, and look through the lens of that coursework, literacy, numeracy, science, look through that lens and use the skills, the academic skills, to research and investigate the problem they care about, learn from a variety of stakeholders. So this is not, we live in these polarized times right now, and we all know how that's affecting education. This is not something that is imposed by the teacher or by any outside influence. There's no agenda here other than what are underlying problems we care about? How can we hear different perspectives? How can we discover the root and systemic causes of the problem and identify solutions that we can agree upon, and then implement those solutions and assess them? So in some ways, it's almost like the cure to polarization, because, when things are presented to us as either ors, and we debate them and we argue about them, often we're not even looking at the underlying problem. We're just choosing sides that have been often fabricated by the media, by our politics, and we're not looking at the underlying problem. So let's say the underlying problem was people don't have enough food to eat. There's food insecurity. Well, it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. We can all agree that that's a problem when people don't have enough food to eat. So how do we come at this, learning from different stakeholders to solve this problem? So in that way, I know I'm really rambling in terms of answering your question, but any teacher can integrate that learning into their curriculum. It is not an add-on, it's an integration and an infusion. Now, some teachers will find they can't easily allow students to pick any problem of concern to them. So let's say you're a science teacher and a student is really concerned with poverty. You're trying to fit the issue into your curriculum. So maybe you need to look at a science-based problem. So, whether it's, a decline in pollinators, or it is, pollution in the ocean, or anything that relates to science, inviting students to pick a problem within that sphere. So it's narrowing it a little, but it's still allowing student agency in the process.
Are there projects that are small enough that the students are themselves working hands-on towards the solution, implementing the solution?
Yes, that's such a good question. Absolutely. And these things can all be done age appropriately too, right? So let's say there's a decline in pollinators. Students can learn about that. And, even on the smallest scale, you can create a butterfly garden or a bee garden. Now, is that going to solve the problem of a decline in pollinators? No, but if it's a spreadable solution, a shareable solution, you can spread that all across Maine. You can spread that to other states. So as long as there is some action that is positive and is systemic and can be shared, we would consider that solutionary. So this raises a really important distinction too that I like to highlight, which is we have a tendency to go straight to humanitarian efforts rather than solutionary efforts. And there is a difference. And I would say all solutionaries should be humanitarians, meaning when there is a crisis, a solutionary would want to intervene and help in some way, whether that's sending food where it's needed or supporting some organization that's doing charitable work where it's needed. Or even doing a beach cleanup or a roadside cleanup. Those are humanitarian efforts. They will not stop the problem from occurring. They do not address the root or systemic causes of the problem. You clean up a beach, a month later, you're going to need to clean up that beach again. It's not stopping the problem. That doesn't mean it's not valuable, and we need students to understand what it looks like to research the causes of problems and to address them systemically. And that's solutionary work. So we actually have a rubric where students can and teachers can help students examine their solutions on this scale from emerging to developing to solutionary to most solutionary. And emerging is where we often will see the more humanitarian efforts, where they're really beautiful, good ideas, but they're not addressing the root or systemic causes. Then there's the challenge of making sure that a solution does the most good and least harm to everyone, to all people, to all species, to the environment. And we often see solutions that may help one group, but cause unintended negative consequences to another. And so, for example, somebody might develop a solution to help hunger issues, but the foods that they are serving cause harm and suffering to animals and are destructive to the environment. So that might be a developing solution. They have a great idea, and it's not yet solutionary because harm is being done through unintended negative consequences. So you move into the solutionary category, and the solutionary category is addressing root and systemic causes, striving not to cause unintended negative consequences, but maybe there are some. And then there's most solutionary, where the solution addresses root and systemic causes and does no harm to any particular group. And that's really hard to do. But knowing that it exists and striving for it is part of the process. So we don't imagine that fourth graders are going to solve all the problems in their communities or let alone the world. And yet, if you learn to think in this way and you get practice doing this, you build up almost like a resume of solutionary thinking and action. And by the time you graduate from high school and go to college or go into the workforce, you bring a solutionary mindset, a solutionary lens where you recognize where there are systemic problems and you strive to solve them. And that's the future that we want. And we believe that if education has this as a goal, if this is actually the purpose of education, right now, the United States Department of Education, the purpose is to prepare students for global competitiveness. And my feeling is that's not as worthy enough for our students and the world that they are both inheriting and shaping, that we need them to be solutionaries and to have this mindset and to have these thinking skills and this practice.
Wonderful. Could you explain a little bit about why this, and you've gone into it a little bit, but I want to give you a little more time to talk about it. Why is this so critical now? Really right now, at this time, this moment in time? And I'll actually give you a tiny little bit of background. I asked that question because I do work with high school students who often, it seems, feel quite overburdened by the perspective that adults have shared with them that they, the students, are the future and are going to solve the problems that we have left for them. And I say have left for them. Hopefully, we're still working on those. But the students have heard this language quite often, that they're the future, they're the hope, they're going to kind of solve these problems. And I think that it's a burden for them. That's what I've heard. And that they don't feel they have the skills, either the inner skills, the kind of emotional resources necessarily, but also just as you were putting it, the thinking, the capacity to understand the world in this way. So that's where that question comes from.
Yes. So this is one of those questions where I wish we'd thought to do this 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago. So why now? The reason is because we didn't do it 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. That, one of the interesting things about the times we live in is that while there are certain problems that are escalating and may become catastrophic, and I'm speaking about climate change, there are many other problems that are that we have made tremendous progress on. Now, it's weird to say that right now at this particular time, as we see some significant backward steps. But those backward steps, that backlash is also in response to progress that was made in many arenas. So it's really important to contextualize the times that we live in. I'm about to turn 61 years old. When I was born, it was illegal in many states for Black and white people to get married. And gay marriage was not even something that anybody spoke of. When I was born, there were waterways and cities with air pollution vastly worse than today, that the air and water is actually cleaner in many of those places. Now, the fires in the West notwithstanding, so that's a separate issue.
But we are here in Maine, and Portland Harbor is a different place than it was in the late 60s.
Exactly. When I was born, half of all people on planet Earth lived in extreme poverty. That number is now below 10%. Now, is that too high? Yes, it is. But it's a whole lot less than 50%. And the fact that we got from 50% to 10% suggests to me we can get from 10% to no extreme poverty. We can do these things. And I think that we are inundated every single day with the problems in the world and escalating problems. And this is also how the media works. The media preys on our fears. This is how you get ratings. I mean, things going well is not news, but crises and threats, that triggers, our human response. Like, we need to be aware of crises and threats. But what's happened is that we then believe that things are vastly worse than they ever were. And it's not true. And it's really important that we teach this to young people. Again, this is the climate change notwithstanding. That is a separate issue, which is getting worse. So I want to tell a story here about, I'm not sure exactly how many years ago, maybe 7 years ago. I was invited to speak at a school in Connecticut, and I spoke to the 5th and 6th graders, and I asked them to share with me what they thought were the biggest problems in the world. And they filled up a whiteboard with problems. One boy even said sex trafficking. This was 5th and 6th graders. So I asked them to raise their hands if they could imagine us solving the problems they listed. And of the 45 children in that room, only 5 raised their hands that they could even imagine us solving the problems they listed. So around the same time, I was doing a professional development day for teachers. And this was actually just a 2-hour session. And I asked the teachers, in 50 years, what do you want the world to look like? And it was basically a fill in the blank. In 50 years, I want the world to be blank. And the first teacher to raise her hand said, still here. And I asked the other teachers, how many of you feel similarly? And most hands went up. So still here, right? I mean, that level of despair that those
Very low bar.
fifth graders, yeah, very low bar. And the teachers felt. Anyway, so back to the kids in that Connecticut school. So I realized I had to change things up. So I asked them to close their eyes and I did a visualization with them. And I asked them to imagine that they were very old and approaching the end of a very long and well-lived life, and that they were sitting on a park bench on a beautiful day and the air was clean and the birds were singing and the waterways were clean. And there hadn't been a war in decades. And nobody went to bed hungry because they had no choice. And we'd learned to treat each other and other species with respect and compassion. So I painted this picture. And then I asked them to imagine a child coming up and joining them on the park bench. And the child had all sorts of questions about how things used to be and how they changed. And then the child asks a final question, which is, what role did you play in helping to bring about this better world? What did you do? So while they had their eyes closed and they were imagining how they would answer that child, I asked them to raise their hands if now they could imagine us solving the problems they listed on the whiteboard. And the ratio flipped. 40 hands went up in the air. It did not take long to restore their hope. What it took was believing that they had agency and power to create change. Now, a couple of years after that, I was in Guadalajara, Mexico, and I was invited to talk to some fifth graders at the school I was visiting. And I asked those students if they could imagine us solving the problems in the world, and every hand flew up in the air. So what was different? What was different was the teacher had been teaching them in age-appropriate ways about problems, specifically environmental problems, and engaging them. She was a science teacher, engaging them in solving them. These children knew problems could be solved because they had been active solving them. The school had put solar panels up. They had replaced the disposable water bottles with refillable water jugs. They had created a compost system at their school. So they knew problems could be solved because they'd been doing it. So to loop back to your question, the despair and hopelessness and anxiety that so many young people are feeling, we do them a grave disservice if we don't engage them in solutionary thinking and action, because it is that very thinking and action that will restore their hope and build evidence-based optimism. So not airy-fairy, pie-in-the-sky optimism, but evidence-based optimism. Things can and have changed. And Joan Baez once said, the singer-songwriter once said, action is the antidote to despair. And David Orr, who's a professor at Oberlin College, he put it this way: hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And I'll give you one more quote.
That's a good one.
I know, I love that one. It's so poetic. Greta Thunberg said, once we start to act, hope is everywhere. Now, Greta has experienced some major anxiety and hopelessness that led her to become the foremost youth climate activist in the world. And she said, once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So we have to be careful not to burden young people saying, sorry, we messed everything up, fix it. I mean, that's not a good message to lay on them. But it's not as if we, just created this problem. This is humanity's long arc that's created these problems. And it's time for solutionary thinking and action to take root more deeply. And we do this together. And together we build a future that can thrive, where all life can thrive.
It sounds too like what you're talking about hope and agency, and then all the stakeholder collaboration that you mentioned too. it sounds like what the teachers would also be working on through the solutionary units or solutionary approach to their year or whichever is a lot about knowing themselves and their values and then communicating with other people to find the shared values. Is that a part of what the teacher's work is in teaching that way?
Absolutely. And that's I'm really glad you brought that up. Again, there's so much fear right now in school systems talking about values and morals and whose values, whose morals. And I can just tell you that as a humane educator for now many decades, I have invited groups of people, teachers, students, audiences everywhere, to answer this question. What do you think are the best qualities of human beings? Because that is actually one of the definitions of the word humane, and I'm a humane educator. So what are the best qualities of human beings? So having asked this question, thousands and thousands of people, the answers are always similar: compassion, honesty, perseverance, courage, generosity, kindness. Nobody says violence, greed, hatred, bigotry. Nobody ever. So the fact is that the vast majority of us agree on the best qualities of human beings. Now, how we put those into practice, we sometimes differ on. But humane education is inviting us to go on that journey. It's fostering our compassion so that we want to make a positive difference, and then working with a variety of people with different perspectives to find ways to make a difference. And that is not imposing anybody's morality on anybody else. This is the kind of work that can cross the political divide and be that corrective to the divisiveness and polarization that has taken hold of our society and is damaging our society. It's damaging learning and what can happen in schools. And it's not giving young people the skills to actually address and solve challenges they see around them.
It sounds not only just humane, but it also sounds very practically humane in that way. I've heard from employers recently here in Maine that their impression is that their younger employees who are coming to them, so people either right out of high school or even college graduates, that they don't have what they term real world experience. They feel that they've been protected too much, and they'll use the word protected or cosseted or coddled. And really say that what they need is for the education system is for the education system to have students have real world experiences, make mistakes, so that when they come to them as employers, as employees, they have a mindset that allows them to approach this job as a problem that they have the capacity and the responsibility to solve in a certain way. And so I wasn't expecting these two worlds to collide, but based on what you just said, it does. And so is there something that you can say about that the kind of practical approach to this, no matter where a student might be going in their lives?
I'm so glad you asked this question. So in my book, The World Becomes What We Teach, I actually, in the appendix, have this section on what we call solutionary career certifications, which overlay onto CTE, career and technical education, because all of these different fields that we can go into, these different professions, whether it's, building and construction, or it's engineering or electrical, or some of the CTE tracks. Well, imagine if we overlay on that solutionary thinking and action. So young people are gaining the skills in those careers to bring solutionary solutions to these various professions that have traditionally not been looking at how can we be sustainable and just and humane? And not just those professions, but whether you're going into law and politics or you're going into healthcare, there's so many different arenas where we can overlay solutionary thinking and action. So students, and if they want, and in San Mateo County, they're actually doing this now, bringing this solutionary career certification so that a student graduates, they have this skill set, and on top of that skill set, they have this way of being a solutionary and thinking about how we actually build structures and we engineer things to be sustainable and humane.
Well, it seems like a very holistic perspective in many ways. And it just brings me back to when you were talking about, again, the agency and hope. And you think, in the long term, right, we don't want just people to be successful in their careers, or we don't want them to just be able to solve the world's problems, but we want them to be happy and satisfied and satisfied in the best possible way because of a life well lived. And that component of understanding things at a systems level, whether you're an electrical engineer or a CNA or a college professor or a teacher, that all these people are still people who then want to have hope, want to feel they can make a difference in the world. And so looking at these systems allows them to connect those dots. So that's wonderful. So I just want to end with can you give us a clear picture? I'm a teacher in Maine. I have a seventh grade and maybe I teach math and language arts, as often happens in many of our schools. I want to be involved. What do I do? What does it look like?
Okay, so first of all, we have a partnership with MCLA, the Maine Curriculum Leaders Association, and we have a brand new position. We have a director of K-12 and teacher education, and the person in that position is Maine's former 2019 Curriculum Leader of the Year, Julie Meltzer, and we are working closely with schools and districts in Maine. So we are here to help. And we have professional development. We have teachers in various parts of the state who are bringing this solutionary framework into their classrooms. And we have this ongoing relationship with MCLA. And we are able to work with Maine teachers and help you to integrate this solutionary framework into your classroom. So I would invite Maine teachers to come to our website. Well, any teachers who are listening, because it's true for everybody. But we have done a fair amount of work here in Maine. We actually piloted our solutionary work here in Maine with teachers from across the state. We had some solutionary summits where teachers came with their students to share the solutionary work that they had done. And so there's more happening in Maine than any other state, than perhaps California, where I mentioned San Mateo County is. So Maine's the place to be for this work. And we hope that teachers will come to our website, humaneeducation.org. And, wouldn't it be fantastic if Maine leads the way and demonstrates what solutionary education or the solutionary framework overlaid on education can look like and be the model for every other state and the world. Why not the world?
I love that vision. Thank you so much, Zoe. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your work with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for all the wonderful work you do, Jennifer.